we'd like to get started. On behalf of Instructional Support Services, it is certainly our pleasure to bring you this panel discussion. We've seen large interest in media assignments, in particular the audio-visual writing assignment. And we've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different faculty and instructors. We've got to see the creative assignments that they're assigning to their students, and we thought there would be great value in bringing their insights to you, letting you hear a little bit about their assignments. So thank you for being here. Our moderator today is Naomi Silver. If you don't know Naomi, she is the Associate Director of Sweetland Writing Center. She also teaches writing courses in digital media for Sweetland's minor in writing. And today she's going to start us off by talking about her insights in audiovisual essay writing. And then we're going to hear from each of our panelists, and then Naomi will facilitate a discussion with the panelists, and we'll take audience question and answers. And during this, please feel free to get up and help yourself to more food and drink. Naomi.
Thank you. It's nice to see everyone here. Yeah, so I'm actually gonna plug Sweetland a little bit for audiovisual and other digital work. I'm really excited to be able to be here with this panel of faculty who have done the hard work of rethinking assignments and transforming them from primarily print-based to digital assignments in various modes. And this flyer may be going around. Is it? Yes. So you may have seen this. And so what I wanted to bring to this conversation too, since ISS is very generously sponsoring this, and these are faculty who have worked with ISS on making these transformations, but we've also been in conversation with ISS and building relations between the work that they're doing and the work that Sweetland does, as well as work that's happening elsewhere around digital media at the library, et cetera, just to let you know that there's a wide range of support for faculty and for students who are doing digital media work and who are in the process of thinking about how do I just got an audio essay assignment, I've never done that before, what do I do? So Sweetland has been working doing this kind of writing work for quite a long time in our own courses, and our faculty who work with students one-on-one in our writing workshop as well as teaching in the university are really, they have a long history of teaching digital media and also working with students in digital media. So I want to let you know that if your students, and this is for the panelists as well, and some of you I think we've talked to specifically about this, if your students are doing this work, they can come to our writing workshop in North Quad and also to our peer writing centers. We have multiple locations, but our main one is in Angel, for help with that work, as well as working with ISS, Blue Corps, and other, well, we'll leave it at that, but other places on campus that offer support. So and what Sweetland focuses on is we can help students with the technical part of this work, but we're really interested in how these assignments work rhetorically. So when students are sitting down to create an audio essay, for instance, one thing they're concerned with is, how do I use the technology, right? How do I edit this? How do I get my footage? So that there's that whole aspect of it. But then the other aspect is, what am I communicating here, right? What argument am I making? Or what creative voice am I putting forward, depending on the kind of assignment it is. And that is where we work with them quite a bit. So they can come in with their back-end video work, and we can talk to them about editing that work, right? And so that if you're going for this argument, why might you choose this shot over that shot? Or how might you transition from this moment to this other moment in the video you're creating, for instance? So, yeah, so part of this is consciousness raising, because we don't get a lot of students who bring that work to us because they think of us mainly as working on papers, which of course we do. We do lots of work on papers, but this was a nice opportunity, and I'm grateful for the chance to let you know that we're not just for papers, that we are for all of these other things too. If you're thinking about doing this work in your class in terms of this transformation, Sweetland also consults with faculty on thinking about well, working with ISS, to think about, well, what technology would work best, what platform would be helpful, but also how are you scaffolding these assignments over the semester? How are they building on each other? If you're looking at a single assignment that's digital and the rest are not, how can you think about for your curriculum over the course of the semester, this digital assignment working in with the others and building on things that they may have learned in more analog forms in their essays, but that they now are using in connection to a different platform in a digital assignment. So we consult with faculty on writing assignments for all courses, but digital writing can be part of that as well. And we've worked with faculty on creating websites or thinking about how they would use a course website, for instance, to showcase papers or to curate exhibitions on graffiti, say, that would then, be available to a public and to the course, to all the students in the course to comment on. So there's a range of ways that we can consult with faculty too, and we talk to ISS to think about, well, these are things that we might work on with the faculty. These are things that maybe you would be, more suited to work on, and we can help coordinate those resources too. So my role today is going to be really getting questions from you at the end of this panel. I'll have a couple of my own after we've heard from our speakers. And yeah, looking forward to this conversation about digital writing. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Anthony King. I'm from ISS, and we're really happy to be here today. I'm introducing Monica Deuce, Assistant Professor of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology. She's going to be talking about her podcast for MCDB 458. I'm going to warn you right now, she's got to leave a little bit early, so she might sneak out. But we're really happy to have her here. Monica was actually one of the first people that I worked with when I got here, so I'm really happy to have her here with us, one of the first websites that I worked at when I got here at U of M. And there's a couple things that were immediately obvious to me when I started talking to her. So one, she cares deeply about the science. Two, she cares very deeply about all of her students. And three, she's her own person, not caged by the superficial expectations of what it means to be a scientist. And she's very aware of how those expectations and societal expectations impact her students, especially minorities and the young women. So I know that if I'm failing her, I'm failing the next generation of young MCDB scientists. So without further ado, go ahead.
Thank you, Anthony. That was really amazing introduction. So, yeah, I've been in Michigan for about 3 years. I'm an assistant professor in MCDB. I'm a neuroscientist. I had a research lab that studies sugar and the brain, and I teach Bio 305, which is a large enrollment science class. It's genetics. It's about 400 students. And the other one is MCDB 458, which used to be 421, which is upper division, mostly senior neuroscience class. That's based on, essentially, we read primary literature in science and discuss it and critically evaluate it. So when I was training in New York City, because I was in New York City, I had the opportunity to do a lot of science and also to explore civic engagement as a scientist. So working at the museums or giving talks like Nerd Night or science cafes, which we have here in Ann Arbor too. But what I realized is that mostly those two things were separated. And so the civic engagement and the outreach was done in a completely different context, at the academic context, and then I would just go to lab and do my sciencey things. And so when I became a professor, I was thinking of ways that I can use the infrastructure that we have at the university to try to incorporate civic engagement with education in my students. So that was the idea of trying to do some forms of outreach. And I haven't really figured out how to do that for my 400 kids class, but I thought I could start with the small class, the MCDB 458, to try to explore ways to do this. I love podcasts, and so I thought, well, what if I just have a final project that have students explore a topic we cover in class and expand it, and then write an essay, and then use the essay to essentially make a podcast transcript of 10 minutes about it. So then they'll make something that's long-lasting, not just for this class. The pedagogical idea behind it is that most of my kids are graduating seniors, and so they spent 4 years studying a lot of really hard, cutting-edge science, sweating up all night and to study for those really hard exams. We put them through, and so I thought, by the time they're seniors, they're mostly being absorbed in science, but they've also become scholars because they've spent 4 years doing this. And now as they step into society, really, they know way more science than anybody they're gonna cross their path, unless their path is a professor, right? And so I thought that now they should be comfortable with not just being sponges and absorbing the science, but also communicating it in a way that's, yes, in medical school, in nursing school, but also in a way that's communicating to the public. And so in a way, this was investing them with this new responsibility they have as they graduate. And the students responded really well to this assignment. They really loved it. I got absolutely perfect score on my teaching evaluations, and most of them were really for this. And I had no idea how to do this, and most of my colleagues thought it was way too much for a junior professor to take up, but I contacted ITS, and then I met with Anthony, and we had really great discussions about outreach and civic engagement to communications, and then we were able to work with him, and then with Sean, who helped my students actually record the podcast to just do it. And I think, some of them are so-and-so, but others are pretty good, and students even made up their own jingles and music for it. And at the beginning, I asked them to do just a 10-minute podcast, 1,000-word essay, and it turns out that most of the essays are very long, and a lot of the podcasts are half hour. So I think it really portrays how excited and passionate and enthusiastic the students were. And we have used the Writing Center to write, but I didn't know that you also consult on more digital projects. So next time I teach the class, so I've only taught it once, and now my students are ready to make their second season. So we can maybe just look at the website that Anthony made. The students, the title of the class is Neuroepigenetics, which studies essentially it's like nurture and nature and how life experiences have a permanent lasting effect on your life, like pollution and other things. So the students came up with the term neuroepic for the podcast. So if you go on top, on about the podcast, on the right, yeah, so you can read a little bit about the rationale, things I've said, and all the people that were involved. CRLT also consulted to make this a fair assignment. And then if you go to podcast topics, my class was about 25 kids, and so they worked in pairs to produce their podcast. And then these are all the topics they chose, and then we can pick one of my favorite, Mom's Meals Made Me. And then on the right here, if you scroll down, you see the 2 students or in the bios who made the project. So I told them their names would go up in there, and so they had to really take responsibility and produce something that they had to be proud of. And then there is an essay. A lot of time, this essay is a little bit longer than I wanted, but then again, you have to understand this is a science class, and it's not really a writing class, so this is only a small part of what we do. And so you can read the essay, and the essay, if you scroll down, has different images to relate to the science. It's really written for the public, so the idea is that you don't really need to know anything about science. One of the students actually wrote a primer on the topic and interviewed a really famous scientist who funded this field, so you can listen to the interviews. That is kind of the first essay and podcast with the interview. And then if you scroll all the way up, that's where the podcast is, and so if you click that, then it will start playing. think that he made the jingle actually kill it. Yeah, in general. So maybe we can just listen to the first few seconds.
Hello, and welcome to the Michigan Neuroepigenetics Podcast. My name is Caleb Vogt,
And I'm Jenny Chen.
and we're your hosts for this segment of the podcast. Today we're going to be talking about food and DNA and the way that they can interact with each other across multiple generations. The more we understand about our diet and our environment, the more we realize they
So all the podcasts are up there. LSA also helped me spread the word on Twitter and Facebook. Oh, you can find me on Twitter. I have a non-scientist handle. My handle is heartcandy000 with a K because we study sugar. So you can follow me there. So all the podcasts are available. And I think we kept track of the stats for a while, and I haven't checked them. But in the first 2 years, I think they were over 5,000 different views on the pages. And like I said, some of them are perhaps not that great, but a few of them are quite good. So, and then afterwards, I'm happy to answer any questions you have about it. Thank you.
So we're all going to be doing introductions today, but if you're not, you have troubles remembering who would be related to your department, we've got this out on the table out here, along with our cards for the different people for different departments. So I thought I'd share that so people could see that.
Good afternoon. I'm Carla Stelbrecht, and I'm here to introduce Professor Van Jordan. So Van and I met one another when I was doing our typical ISS onboarding. So we started out talking about Canvas way back when, but it was a great introduction and became a great partnership. We're so appreciative of the perspective he's given us. He is a nice mix of a filmmaker and a poet. Helping us think about how to scale this so that more students can have this be a part of their academic work has been really exciting. So here's Van.
So I started a few minutes before we came in this room bending Vincent's ear about my failures in the classroom. And it seems like many of these ideas come from that experience first, like starting a class, not necessarily knowing how to approach it, how to use the material, and just sort of refining it over time. And so I'm not Van Jones, but I am. But I do admire his work. What I did this past semester, I worked with two classes. One was English 340, which I call the historic hinge. And in that class, the students research one topic all semester, and then they write poems to that topic. And the topic is a historical topic, but it has to be tethered somehow to the current moment. And with that, they'll write poems, and they'll do a spectrum of revision that I'll appraise. And then they'll also talk about the research and the process of developing the research and collecting, going to archives. They come to the library. They have a library day in which they have some time with the wonderful Sigrid Cordell over there, who walks them through the process of researching their topics. And they also have access to Sigrid throughout the semester. They put together a research packet for them based on their topics, and they find various archives and delve into that. I don't usually give them much of a restriction around what they can choose for their topics. One semester I had some students who came to me, they said they wanted to do Frederick Douglass, and 3 white students. And I thought, are they just doing this because I'm black? Why they want to do this? And they said, no, we've been thinking about this, and Frederick Douglass, his stump speeches and his work with newspapers is tantamount to the work that's happening now in social media. and they were able to create this website that dealt with Frederick Douglass and had written poems in his voice, like Robert Hayden. And then they actually did poems around different social media figures, like Facebook Girl, who was very instrumental in the Arab Spring movement. The other class, Modern Poetry, is a class, it's Modernist Poetry 1900-1940. It's a class that I hated when I was an undergrad. And when I first taught the class here, I didn't enjoy teaching it either. And so, because I was teaching it the way it was taught to me. And so I was here for 6 years, I left for 3, and I came back. And during that time, the student I had in that class is now, he's going on to grad school, he's now our undergraduate coordinator in our department. And he thought, well, you know, Van knows how to teach this class, I'll just give him this, not knowing I hated teaching that class. And so I had to take another swing at it. And this time I thought, okay, I'm going to try to teach this class in a way that I wish I had it taught to me. And so what I did was I put the students in groups, and they adopted a poet for the semester that they were going to research in that modernist period. And then they had 3 podcasts they had to put together. The 3 were a 5-minute, a 10-minute, and a 15-minute. The 5-minute podcast, they debated which of their poets had the greatest influence into the 20th and 21st century, coming out of the modernist period. And then the second one, they talked about an event that all 3 of their poets would have sort of been orbiting around, either the World War I, or it could have been the advent of the rites of spring, or the Dust Bowl, something that may have affected all of their poets. And then the final 15-minute podcast was a podcast in which they dealt with an expert that they would bring in to talk to them about the theme of their group. Each group had a theme that they dealt with as well. And in that podcast, they would have just a conversation with this expert. So the first one was a debate. The second one was around an event, and the third one was basically a conversation. Going back to the historic hinge, similar format, 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute podcast. The first podcast, the 5-minute podcast, was anchored around intentionality. So they would sort of introduce their topic and the historical subject matter. The 10-minute podcast was a podcast in which they brought in an artifact. So something that was representative of that historic period that they were going to talk about, a single item. And then the 15-minute podcast, once again, was a conversation with an expert in the field. I got 4 minutes. Okay, so why don't we maybe hear a little bit of Title IX? So these women put together this webpage. They all had to put together a homepage, is what we were calling it, and that listed their research, and they would have their poems there, and they would have links to their podcasts as well. If we go, I think, back to the top there. Okay, so they have the podcast. Let me podcast one. Let's see what that sounds like. So the thing that, because they have their own podcast web pages, they have to go to Box when you hit the link. So maybe let's play the first part of that.
Was it fair when Brock Turner got sentenced to only 6 months after being found guilty of assault?
Was it fair when Columbia senior Emma Sulkowicz had to graduate next to the man who raped her?
Every 98 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted.
1 in 5 women on college campuses will be assaulted.
Less than 1/3 of campus sexual assault cases result in expulsion. Welcome to Title IX, Breaking Barriers. On this week's episode, we will be discussing our personal interest in Title IX and the pop culture movements that have sparked our debate.
Okay, that's good. Thanks. And so that's an intro to theirs. If we can go back to the other class, Modern Poetry. So maybe Welcome to the Wasteland. So Welcome to the Wasteland, this was the group that I was talking about before, where they sort of start their debates around their favorite poets, the poets who had the greatest influence. Maybe we can start with the first one.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Wasteland. I'm Claire.
I'm Sam.
I'm Monica.
I'm Maria.
And today we're going to be discussing modernist poets.
As suggested by the podcast title, our podcast will incorporate the theme of death. And although Halloween is now over, we're still living in some spooky times.
Now for our poets. I'll be talking about T.S. Eliot. Thomas Stearns, born in Missouri in 1888.
All right, so that was their introduction to their podcast. So one thing also I should probably say at this point is that with all of these projects, they were basic just an idea, and so it's not like I thought, I can handle teaching them how to use put together a podcast or make a web page. I can't do any of this stuff, and so I come here, and I'll talk to Carla, or Sean's going to help us in a couple of weeks. Jan has been working with them with the recording and guiding them through that. Blue Core has been very helpful this semester with a class that I have that's using film as well. And so the resources are here, and it's been a learning process for me as well. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel from ISS, and I'm here to introduce Vincent Longo. He's currently a doctoral student with Screen Arts and Cultures, and he's really kind of been at the forefront of kind of creating and curating some really great, innovative, rich learning experience for students in SAC 236. And I first met Vincent when him and Professor Matthew Solomon came to ISS to kind of think through how we might kind of make this audiovisual essay kind of happen, what we could do to support them. And so we've worked together to kind of make that happen for SAC 236. So, Vincent?
Great. Thank you. So while I'm going to be talking about a film course today, and which seems sort of like an obvious option to do audiovisual assignments, the sort of key goal of my talk will be that these audiovisual assignments can be integrated into courses regardless of field, regardless of whether or not you know how to make these audiovisual assignments, whether your GSIs know. There's tons of resources here. So while I'm going to be talking about SAC 236, the Intro to Film course, and how the audiovisual assignments help, I think, better our learning goals in that course, I'm also going to talk about more generally how they also connect to sort of multidisciplinary benefits that you can adapt in biology or English or anything like that. So go to the next slide. So just a little bit about, next one actually, 236. So we on average have about 150 students per semester. And these students generally do not become SAC majors. They also come in with very little experience as filmmakers. So our polls indicate that only about 10% of these 150 students a semester consider themselves proficient with editing software of any kind. Most of them have never touched it, in fact. And we always have 3 GSIs. Other than myself, I have a background in film directing. They also have not had any experience with editing or filmmaking. Likewise, Professor Solomon, he had no experience. Throughout this process, he's also tried to see, can the methods in which we use to teach the technical skills work for a tenured faculty member? And I'm glad to say they have. He, for the first 2 semesters, made the assignments along with the students, and the students actually got a chance to critique his work, and they actually gave him a grade as well. He almost always did worse than them, so anybody can learn it. So what I have up here are just sort of the main learning goals for the course, and these haven't changed. Essentially, we're teaching film analysis, we're teaching the critical vocabulary in terms of identity and just in terms of film analysis in general. But the sort of main reason why we decided to turn to audiovisual assignments was 2 things. One is we believed it would be a better representation of the major. So though this is SAC 236, it's probably should be a 100-level course. It's the introduction to the major. Like I said, most of the time it's taken by non-majors. So we thought that we not only wanted the students to see, to test their ability to sort of apply the technical terms that they've learned about and they've seen and see if they can sort of make them in constructive ways. Likewise, we just wanted to be a better representation of the major. If students never take another Screen Arts course, we want them to have sort of the technical ability to be able to make it in whatever field, to make a video in whatever field they're in. It doesn't matter if you're in the hard sciences, there are a ton of media material, and I think that that's fertile ground to make essays like this. Likewise, we want educated people in those particular fields to be making the audiovisual essays, to be making the models, and we hope to at least sort of set the ground for them to be able to do that. So I want to jump back to the first slide, actually. So I'm going to show you guys an example of one assignment, one student example, and I believe this student came in with a little bit of audiovisual expertise. I wouldn't say he was an expert, but he had worked with an editor before. But this is not, while it's quite good in terms of technical polish, it's not uncharacteristic of the work that we'll see. So we'll just see a couple minutes of that, or at least 1 minute. We'll put this online. I definitely encourage you to watch the whole thing. As a little bit of setup, so this assignment, it's the second assignment that we have. We have 3. If you could actually go 2 slides ahead. We have 3 assignments. In this one, the students are supposed to make an argument about the role of a single motif in one of the films we've watched. And we encourage them, unlike the other assignments, to not use voiceover narration and try to sort of make their argument with small bits of text as well as sort of the structure in which they organize their clips. And we think this sort of benefits in terms of our course in a couple ways. One is it allows the students to directly quote and manipulate the form that they're using. So like English or anything like that, where you can quote the actual source material exactly how it is, audiovisual essays allow us to do that. The biggest factor, though, and I think this applies to anyone who wants to make audiovisual assignments or podcasts, is the greater capacity to disseminate and share student work. I've never been to a festival where students read their essays. I want to be invited to that festival, but in this case, we have a film festival every year, and it's well attended both by students, faculty, staff, who are willing to sit down for a couple hours and actually watch all of these examples. The students want to put them online. My office hours every week are just full, honestly. Like at least 5 or 6 students every hour that I do this will come in, want to show their work to me and say, I really want to make the festival. I want to share this with my family. I already think that's sort of a big push in the right directions in terms of student scholarship. Likewise, we want the students to be able to build upon each other's work. Again, I'd like the idea, in a perfect world, we'd share sort of student essays, or the students would share essays with each other so they could learn from each other. That doesn't usually happen. In this case, with their permission, we're building a database of student research so they can go back and they can say, I don't want to start analyzing this film from scratch. I want to see what other students have done, so scholarship continues to grow. I don't get the same essay about stairs in a Hitchcock film. They know somebody has talked about that. You can cite it, quote it, and help sort of build other arguments. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, so a couple sort of just key things to keep in mind when you're designing audiovisual assignments, I think. One is that the assignments need to be scaffolded in terms of technical abilities, but as well as sort of the analytical concepts. So I think that's common when we design assignments. We start pretty simple in terms of, they don't even know all the terms for the course, and then they slowly build up. The same is true with the technical abilities and in terms of how long the assignments are. So the assignment starts extremely short. The first one is 60 seconds to 90 seconds. Usually it just involves very basic manipulation, voiceover, match to image, that's it. And then it continues. The second assignment, they are forced to not use narration. They want to think about, how do I show every example of the motif? So in that example, I think he said that there are 237 instances where that motif exists, and every single one of those is in his assignment. So we require that. So if you have a motif where there's 2, you have to make a 3-minute assignment about 2 examples of that motif. In this case, you could have 200, 300, it depends. And they're forced to think about, okay, how can I do that in 3 minutes? And how can I sort of use the form in which I'm organizing this to help my argument along? Go to the next one. The last thing that I would recommend, and this is really appropriate for our field in terms of film studies, but I think it works with sort of any audiovisual assignment. I highly recommend that students write a script for whatever they're going to do. And that script doesn't mean it's like a film script. I mean literally like write the essay as if you were going to write the essay. I'm not saying that you should write the script and then just read it and then put it over images. I'm saying that you should write the essay as if you would write it and turn it into me. And then you should stop and think about, okay, here's the argument I want to make. How can I bolster that with the way I'm editing the clips, what clips I'm choosing? That might mean that you cut complete sections of your script and change them to purely audiovisual form, but it helps give them some sort of structure. The last thing that I just want to say is you can do this. This is only possible through meetings with Sweetland, through ISS. They have the resources here, and the students will use it. We have, I think our class, we've had 450 students. They've made great use of this and been able to make assignments like this constantly every year. So, thank you.
Lahiri, assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literature. She's. Is the mic on?
The mic's on. There's a button on it.
It's on. There's a red light. Oh yeah, low battery. Okay. I'm still Anthony. Nice to meet you. Introducing Madhumita Lahiri, assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literature. She's been working with a upper level writing class, English 375, Intro to Indian Film. She's one of the more adventurous faculty I've worked with, diving into complex new assignments as a matter of course, and really pushing students to think in unique ways, getting to think and write about the world from a new perspective. So, go ahead.
I have to say that I feel like this project was mostly made up by Sean and Anthony, and I just took notes and communicated it. But I did have the original problem, which is when I taught this Indian film course the first time. Have most of you seen some Bollywood, or do you have some sense, right? So they show up, they're super excited. Either I get this total mix of students who have nothing to do with the humanities, but have grown up watching the films. I get some students who are in the English majors and have decided this is the one semester they'll learn something about a place other than England or the US. I get film majors who have never seen it. You know, I just get this like total variety pack. And the films themselves are incredibly long. So they're 3 hours. So then we assign some, and I assign some critical scholarship with it. And then getting them to do the writing as well, because it's an English class, they expect to learn how to write. And not everyone can write very well. And I've got 14 weeks and 10 3-hour films. And the languages, they don't have the languages. They can't access the secondary material. They don't know the history. I'm giving a lecture on the partition of India and Pakistan. It's like, there's just way too much going on. So the video essay became a really convenient way to make the final writing assignment both easier and harder. So it was easier in the sense that they got to work in groups, they got to, and they didn't have all the hang-ups they often come in with writing. And it was a hell of a lot harder, sorry, I shouldn't curse up here, which they didn't realize because they actually had to have evidence for every single word they used, right? So the film I used for the final one it's called Haider. It's an Indian version of Hamlet. Well, Indian version of Hamlet. It's a Bollywood adaptation based loosely on Hamlet. It's set in Kashmir, which is contested between India and Pakistan and has a lot of military problems. And it was very controversial. So, of course, I have some students who came and said, oh, we're going to write our video essay on this, and we're going to say how it's anti-India. And I said, okay, sure. And then they came back, and they were like, oh, but we couldn't find it. Right? Because they had to, if they had written the paper, I would have gotten that same kind of essay where it's like, and then I felt this, and then this Twitter article said that. But when they did the actual essay, they couldn't find it, and they ended up doing something about camera angles. Oh, no, it was true. So I'll show you a little bit. I don't know if, has anyone seen this movie? So I'll show you just the film major example, actually, because it's just fun to watch. So unlike the class that Vincent was talking about, technical skills are not at all a goal for this class. The assignment that I asked them to do was just a voiceover essay. So they're just writing a paper. Don't tell them that. But they thought they were doing something else. They were writing a paper, and they were continuously workshopping it with 2 other classmates. Now, you try to tell them to do that, and they're just got a piece of paper in front of them. They're not interested. But they think it's a video. They're like, oh, can I put it on YouTube? Then they got super into it. But these are I put all the film majors together. I only had 3 of them because otherwise I got the sense that they'd cover all the kind of technical stuff and no one else would learn. So this is just a fun one to give you a sense of the object that I used. But yeah, just the first couple of minutes.
कबूल है कबूल है कबूल है कबूल है खुरम मीर वलद हुसैन मीर आपको गजाला अख्तर दफ्तर अकबर खान से निकाह कबूल है
Hey there. My name is Brielle, and I'm here along with Caitlin and Emily to discuss the ever-so-epic Header. Like other Bollywood movies, Header contains moments of spectacle which appear to rupture the narrative. Unlike the big song and dance numbers in much of conventional cinema coming out of Mumbai, however, spectacle in Vishal's adaptation of Hamlet is used to confront issues head-on.
UN Council Resolution number 47 of 1948, Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, and Article 370 of the Indian Constitution.
Around 90 minutes into the film, Header makes a speech to his fellow countrymen concerning the Armed Forces Special Powers Act of the Indian Constitution. The way this scene functions is not that far from a Shakespearean soliloquy. In this moment, he seems to speak if not only to himself, then at least directly to the film's spectators, bypassing the audience right in front of him. When analyzing the formal elements of this sequence, one would notice
So this one is probably the one that has the most, and they've got some cutaways and stuff, and they use a different, the others, I was told them just to use iMovie. I think they had another software that they used, so they used that. One of the things that's quite interesting for me as someone assessing it is that if they had used this kind of argument in a written essay, then the nature of it is that you give the examples, right? And then you have to kind of get into, did you fully analyze the example? Which they didn't. These students have film experience, but they don't have the language, they can't catch the historical references, they can't catch the costuming. But because the rhythm of an essay which has a visual component is totally different, it allows them to really work to their strengths in certain ways. Does that make sense a little bit, right? So then the other example, which we don't really have time to show, but I highly recommend, is an example from students who wanted to talk about how the mother-son relationship is creepy. And they were like, oh, and I liked this costume, this article we read about costume design and the argument that costume makes. So what that allowed me to do was just to say, okay, go for it. And then they ended up with this really interesting thing about red, because they had to find it in every single scene, right? So they come up with something and they get into the idea that writing is a continuous process of redrafting, which is an extremely unsexy thing to tell students, right? But they learn it on their own. There's some other ones which I haven't shared with you, which are about the, that were really funny and that were, that used sound effects. They were really interested in getting it on YouTube and seeing who would watch it and so forth. What I had them do to present it, I had them present it in class and then have discussion questions. So what they ended up doing in terms of mimicking is I used every frame of painting, which is the one that Sean suggested, to give them an idea. But they also were able to mimic what I do in class with them, right? So I'll show them a clip and then I'll go over it. So it really was a way of thinking about a kind of pedagogical approach to writing. And it really solved that problem that I often have as well when I do kind of traditional writing on paper assignments, where it's they try just to write for me, which makes for an extremely bad paper, which assumes too much knowledge and just thinks it's about impressing you, right? So this really got them to kind of look outwards to their peers. I think the thing I would do differently is instead of doing it as a culminating project, I think there's a way in which one could do this stuff earlier. And once they've realized what it's like to write for something that is collaborative, that has to be shown in that way, they could go back to writing in a way that's more private, right? And understand what redrafting is and what conversation looks like. Yeah, I guess we can show part of this. It's less technically sophisticated, but it's a nice argument.
Emily, to discuss the ever-so-epic header.
Oh, that's the
Like other Bollywood...
Yeah. I mean, you do end up with certain kinds of logistical challenges with the group work, but that I don't think is different from... Oh, that's fine then. You can live in suspense. I will... Yeah, it's an interesting... They did give me the scaffolding bits. They gave me the script and that kind of thing. I didn't end up grading it as much as I would have. Oh, that is the major caution I would give you. So, normally I give A's to papers where I'm like, I don't see how this could be a better paper. Now, because they're better at this stuff than I am, the grades were really high. And so I would just think about that, because I was like, oh my God, this is so good. They're so motivated. So yeah, if you're worried about grade inflation and you get easily impressed by audiovisual essays, just think about that. But yeah, thank you.
Panelist is Sean Jackson. I'm Elizabeth Foman, and I'm with the Instructional Support Services. It's not your imagination. There are 6 consultants that have been up here, back and forth. I've worked with Sean almost every day since I've been here. I've almost been here 2 years. He's been here much longer than that. He's been here since 2014. Sean wrangles all our media students, and he has a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge. He also has a Michigan Emmy, which I did not know until I read this bio. Sean's also an alumnus. He's an alumnus from LSNA, so he is a resource that I go to every single day, not just for media, but for lots of other things too. He's a philosopher, and he's very practical in dealing with the video, but also gets some really creative work out. Today he's going to share some considerations and best practices regarding the design and assessment of video and audio assignments.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I want to thank you all for coming to this. I think I'm really excited about being part of this growth of video projects across LSA, across disciplines. to share a kind of short personal story about myself and kind of the power of this kind of experience, not necessarily video, but just like thinking outside of the box as far as beyond papers. I went back to school after 10 years of being out of school. And I initially went back to school to do social research. I was really keen on becoming a sociologist. And I took a video class on a whim. I inherited a camcorder from somebody and wanted to learn how to use it better. And day 2 of that class, they had me shoot something with the camera creatively. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And I realized that was what I wanted to do. Not sociology, but video work. And I wouldn't have had that experience if I hadn't gone outside of the sociology kind of bubble of paper and research and field research. And so I'm really excited about this because I think, not saying that people are going to have my experience, but I think you could unlock in these students that you have doing these projects hidden talents, hidden interests, or even hidden passions like what happened with me. And so I think this is a really important when you think about like what the role of a liberal arts degree is, right? And so kind of expand experiences, and this really fits in that. So I wanted to talk today about some of the kind of more practical considerations when you go to design one of these assignments. I know this is just things that I've kind of picked up along the way. Your mileage may vary on some of this, but this is, and I actually agree and disagree with some of the things people have said up here as far as their own experiences go. But really, it's going to be you running through the class a couple of times before you really find the best way to run it for your course. But there are some things to consider. So one is to think about like what kind of video project works best for your course, right? So, the video essay, which is like, exploding on YouTube as far as the explainers videos, or the longer form essays like Every Frame of Painting or Lindsay Ellis or people like that, those are really great if you're going to do like solo projects, right? Podcasts are also really great for solo projects. They're great as in they are just basically either like presentation projects that you can turn into a video assignment or papers that you can turn into an assignment. You can also do documentaries, right? Have them go and interview people out in the field, do original research, right? The only con to that is that you're going to have them plan out. They're going to need the access to talk to the people. So they kind of have to think about that as well. And then in terms of like skits or shorts, think about it in terms of like students synthesizing the material and presenting it in a creative way, right? And so skit does not necessarily mean that's just going to be, an intro language course kind of skit that, you could have somebody take and just take an idea and inject it into something creative. You can do this either really low production value or high production value. It really depends on how much you want to devote your class to devote to it. The more complex, the more time it's going to take, and the more expertise it's going to have. Also, a note about solo versus group projects. Group projects, video is very time intensive. Even the like podcast editing portion takes a while, and so being able to share that load across a group is really valuable. It's not to say you can't do solo projects. It's just that when you have group dynamics, it spreads that load out. Also, consider your educational goals. How does this project enhance, the student experience of the course? How does it help them take the course content and think about it in a different way? And you also want to think about like what skills you're asking them to learn, right? Especially if you're not teaching a screen arts course. Many of the students may have almost no experience with a camera or no experience with an editing program. And so you don't want to have them dive into the deep end without the proper support and framework around it. I want to talk a little bit about freedom of choice. But by that I mean choice of topic, choice of camera, choice of editing software. Students want it, right? And it's very tempting to say, oh, make a 10-minute video about whatever you want, but it has to relate to the course content, and then walk away. But the problem is that students will very, very easily bite off more than they can chew. They're gonna create video projects that will be way too complex for them to complete in the time frame, or they're going to get stuck on an idea that doesn't work, and like they're gonna have sunken time into this bad idea, right? Or this like idea that doesn't necessarily get the goal that you're trying to get them to accomplish. Also, if you don't give them any kind of scaffolding or any kind of like rubric, you're going to get this wide variety of stuff coming in, right? Mar23 talked about it a little bit. It's going to affect your ability to assess their work properly. In addition to when it's shown, if you share the work amongst the students, there might be a sense of competitiveness that comes out of the students. And they may actually kind of feel bad that they didn't make something as good as this other course, this other group that had 2 film majors in it, right? I also think you should think about in terms of like what you want your final products to look like, right? And think about building it from the back end, backwards. What do you want your students to create? And then figure out how they're going to create that, right? If you want something like Every Frame of Painting, you're going to want to give them the whole film. You're going to want to give them, access to good audio equipment and good editing software. You also want to think about like what kind of students you have in your course. If you have a lot of media savvy students, right, and a lot of communications majors or SAC majors, you can kind of build more complexity in because there's going to be that kind of knowledge and help, right? ISS and Sweetland can provide a lot of support, but there's going to be a lot of time where those students are going to be by themselves and going to struggle if they don't have the experience or the support network or the framework to be able to pull that off. A couple more things. Time commitment. So I think everyone here kind of can think in their head about how long it takes a student to write a 10-page research paper. But I think very few of us can really conceptualize how long it takes to make a 10-minute film, right? And so it's very time consuming, and it's very time consuming on the back end of it, the editing portion. And there's a lot of, like I say here, a lot of hidden tasks for video production. There's equipment gathering, there's logging and transferring of footage, there's backing up of footage, exporting, all this stuff that kind of gets built into the video project that just adds time. Doesn't add into the students' content, it doesn't make it better, but it does consume a lot of time. So it's helpful to kind of consider, how long it would take to create the project versus how long the writing project would take, and kind of make those adjustments as you go. Maybe it's a less complex project, and the video is a portion of it. I think also students should know who they're making the video for. Is it going to be something public, or is it going to be something that's just going to be for the class? Because then they're going to be able to tailor that content for the audience. If they know it's just going to be for the course, they may focus more on the content rather than the polish of the piece. I think also rubrics really help. If you're able to give them a sense of what you think is important for the assignment, that's going to help them keep on track. And one more thing that I want to say is about group projects in general. So think of video projects. If you ever took like a computer engineering course, those group projects are stressful because there's a time crunch, right? And there's an expertise crunch. That is the same thing in video projects. It's kind of a pressure cooker for conflict. And so you kind of have to be aware that that's happening, right? That can be assessments, group assessments later, things like that. There can be very easily an imbalance of time and commitment in those projects. So just be aware of that. So real quick, I'll be real fast about this, about the equipment options. So there's a lot that we have here. And here in this center, we have a lot of resources. And there's generally a few different types of software that they can use for video editing and for audio editing. My biggest advice here is to think about who is in your course. If it's people who may not have experience with this stuff, make it as simple as possible, right? And make everyone use the same stuff, because that way you're going to get that even playing field of finished product for you to be able to assess properly. If you say, oh, use whatever you want, then the people who know cameras will go take out fancier cameras than everyone else, and they're going to get a shallow depth of field, and they're going to get these beautiful looking things, and everyone else is going to use their cell phone camera, and it's not going to look as good, although that's not as much as it is nowadays, as it was. So yeah, feel free to contact me if you have any thoughts about creating a project like this. I can help you and connect you with the kind of resources that you want to that you'll need for your project. Yeah, so thank you.
I'm going to move this over here. No, because I'm holding my notebook. But thank you. So thank you to our panelists. This was really interesting, and I learned a lot and got a really nice sense of exciting things happening around the campus. I wanted to just pull out a couple threads that I thought were interesting, and then I have a question for the whole panel, which Sean started to address, and then we'll turn it over to your questions as well. So one thing that I took away from this panel is that doing digital assignments is fun. Students enjoy it. And this came out in the sense of, coming to office hours, putting in more time than they expect. And on the one hand, as Sean pointed out, that could be a negative if it's too much time. But in our experience working with students at Sweetland, and what I'm hearing from the panelists here, is that they're motivated to keep going back and to think in some ways harder about what they're doing than when they're writing a more traditional paper, simply because they think they get what a traditional paper is. Whether that is true for the course you're teaching is a question, but they think they know what that is. Whereas this shakes things up and takes them out of their comfort zone usually, and usually leads them to try things that they wouldn't otherwise. And it gets them thinking about revision and understanding that if I'm writing, it's not just a one and done, which in many courses they'll do unless there's a revision process built in. But here they understand that I can't just make a movie the night before. I have to plan it, I have to scaffold it for myself, I have to, storyboard it and think about where I'm getting my materials, etc., as well as the editing. The editing is also a place where thinking happens, and I think that that's not something that we all go into assigning video work understanding, or that students understand, but that when they're doing that work of deciding which clip do I use, how do I put it together, how fast do I go, they're making arguments there. And I think that that is something exciting for students too. Madhumita talked about the ways that you may have to step back from your expectations of the depth of argumentation, but at the same time, they're because it is a different genre, but they're thinking about, if I'm moving from this to this, I'm doing it for a reason. And I'm saying something there that I want to say, which they're not always doing when they move from paragraph to paragraph in a paper. That students will come into Sweetland and will say, oh, so why did you organize it this way? And they're like, oh, well, that's just how I thought of it. So getting students to kind of go back and restructure and rethink what they're doing is something that this can really develop, this kind of work. It's also exciting for the faculty, right? As Van was saying, that it can refresh your sense of a class. So if you've been teaching a class for a while and you want to shake it up, bringing in a digital assignment can really do that. And it energizes, and it's just exciting to see their work up online too. The other piece of this is that it also opens up the idea of audience, right? Several of our speakers talked about how having this work public and students understanding that they're not just writing it for the teacher, which they mistakenly often think is true, brings home the idea that when you're communicating, you're communicating to someone. You have a reader or a viewer in mind, and that's a really important part of writing in any form. So this allows them to do that, but it also allows them to learn from each other, to see past models. We've found that really exciting in the Sweetland Minor, where their students are looking at the electronic portfolios that previous students in the program have created, and that really gives them a sense of possibility, and it can also keep you from getting the same paper year after year, as Vincent pointed out. A few of our speakers pointed to the idea that neither you nor your students have to be experts or even have done this before in order to make this work, right? That you have to be willing, you have to be game, right? And you also, in some ways, if you haven't done it before as a faculty member, it can be an exciting thing to learn alongside the students. And this gives you that opportunity, right? That you may, and it gives them a certain empowerment in relation to you as well, which can be great. But that there are the resources to help you do it if you haven't done it before. So that in itself shouldn't be a barrier. We also heard from our panelists that this can work, and we've seen, because of the range of fields represented here, that this can work in any number of fields, right? So that's the other thing to think about. This is not a humanities thing, or an English thing, or a film studies thing. It's a STEM thing. It could be a math thing, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And thinking about STEM fields as well as humanities fields, as Monica brought up, that this is a way to help bridge the academic and the public, right? So it's a way to reach out and have students thinking about reaching a broader public and making their ideas known in a way that matters. And that's really exciting to students too, that someone might actually care about this, right? It's not just this thing that I have to turn in and then it's gone forever. One other point I would make, this goes to Sean's story about unlocking hidden talents, maybe passions. Doing this kind of work or giving your students a variety of ways to approach an assignment like this also speaks to ideas of inclusive teaching, right? And sort of giving that some students really excel in writing papers and they have a lot of experience, they're very verbal, they can put together that kind of argument. But other students, you know, have less experience with that and they have more experience in other fields. They have more experience with media, perhaps with social media. And so giving them a variety of ways to meet the expectations of your course allows them to shine in different ways. And this is a point that was made on our panel too, but I want to highlight that because I think it's something that doesn't maybe come to mind immediately. So the question all of you raised, you know, talked about grading in various ways. And Monica, you mentioned that some of your students definitely had stronger podcasts than others, and Sean talked about sort of leveling the playing field in terms of equipment. But I did want to ask, we didn't hear yet, sort of how did you grade these, right? How was it different from what you've done before? Maybe, because I think that is often something we hear in Sweetland and also in writing studies more generally as faculty are trying to incorporate digital media. I don't know how to grade it, right? It's not what I'm used to. So if you could just give a sense of your experiences, things that worked, maybe things that you changed from year to year to make it better, that would be great. And then we can open it up.
I guess the best word to describe the way I graded would be graciously. Typically our science classes are kept at a pretty low GPA to fight grade inflation. And so my class had a much higher GPA than any of the other science classes I teach. The assignment was only worth 20% of their grade. And because I had an essay, I graded them more heavily on the essay. And in the essay, people have different writing ability and different communicative ability. So I tried to see if they essentially incorporate elements that we talked about during semester. So they have to cover 5 primary research articles in the essay and the podcast. And so I asked them to essentially go over things. What did they show? What did they not show? So whether instead of just regurgitating the science, they could also critically evaluate it. So from a scientific perspective, that was pretty important to me. And I focused my grading a lot more on that than the stylistic components on the podcast. I didn't think it would be fair to give, you know, my favorite podcast the best grade. So I tried to stay more true to the scientific aspect of it than the artistic aspect of it, if it makes sense.
Yeah, so for this class, the creative component is something that is the final project for the class. Along the way, there are also more traditional assignments. I usually assign 3 to 4 written annotation assignments, and those are 2.5 to 3 pages. And those are very guided assignments around things like tracking the way time works in a poem, tracking the movement from exterior imagery to interiority of a speaker in a poem. So they're looking at those things, and then the application of that comes through in the creative part of it. And so there's a traditional grading that I do, just like sort of grading a paper, marking it up, and then there's this creative component. And I like to front load the class with the more traditional stuff and start giving them assignments for the creative part along the way as well. But those assignments along the way are just to give them feedback. So they don't necessarily get graded on the creative component until the very end. And along the way, they're getting feedback, they're refining, they're refining, they're refining. And once they get to that last day when they're presenting the work, they have the grades for the written assignments, the papers they've written. But that last part is strictly the presentation. It's, like a lot of the panelists, I don't tell them this. I hope none of them are here, but so I'm less, right, exactly like this. So I'm less concerned with how good they are, those final projects. I'm more concerned with how much effort they put into them. And that's why I have them do the spectrum of revision and show that process. I want them to fully engage the process of revising and revising and revising. And I tell them, I'm not grading you on how much I like the poem. I'm grading you on how many revisions you do on the poem. And because that revision is shown, they can actually see the morphing of the poem over time. And when they get to that larger final project, it's just their engagement, just the fact that they've taken a poet. If there's a student who walks away from the semester, they know more about Wallace Stevens than they did before, that's a win.
So I haven't graded assignments before for witness in this, but I do have a couple of things that I'll add to kind of piggyback off of what Van said. If there's any way that you can scaffold in a revision point, right, where students give you a rough cut of what they have, and then they go back and they try to improve it from there, by all means do that, because that'll give them the opportunity to produce polished work that you want to potentially show beyond the class, beyond your department. The other thing I'll say too is it's really helpful to give students inspiration examples, like we've talked about Every Frame of Painting, or ASAP Science, or places like that on YouTube, or PBS has a lot of great explainer videos. To use those as inspirations, but don't use them as your grading models, because you got to realize that those videos are generally made by a team of people that is their life, right? And so these students are often taking 15, 18 credit hours, and shoving this in can be really limited. So they may not have time to create the quality that you'll see in a site that makes its money by being quality.
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't grade my students on their filmmaking abilities, quite honestly. The rubric that I use was adapted off of just written essays, and I validate that by the idea that I want the students to be better rhetoricians, not necessarily better filmmakers. So, I think that the AV form allows rhetoricians to do different things, and I want the students to try to think about how they can add that to sort of their toolbox, their communicative toolbox, but I don't grade on that. Hypothetically, I've never had this happen, but if a student wrote an amazing essay and they read it in voiceover narration and I could understand it, it was at a good pace, and it was matched up just generally to the examples that they were talking about, they would get an A, because I'm looking for a strong argument that feeds into evidence and a conclusion. I'm not necessarily looking for them to be the next Spielberg.
I think that it was exciting for me. I didn't have a rubric to be grading them in a genre that's evolving because they had 2 papers that were formal before that, and the grades were pretty low. Because it takes them a long time to shift away from kind of generalities or just like writing a movie review, and they can't aim for the level of writing that they're seeing in the scholarship they're reading, right? So with this one, I think what was difficult in a way is, no, it wasn't so much difficult. They just did a great job. And I mean, comparing the funny one with the serious one didn't seem very obvious to me, like how that would work. So it was more, how do these work on their own terms? I think that putting it earlier in the term would have allowed me to raise the bar for the written papers. Because I spend so much time to explain to them that they have to have evidence for every single claim they make. And the video made that clear. The video made revision clear. It improved the kind of peer relations. And I think, I mean, it might be moving forwards that I'll ask them, and I think I could now that I have student examples of like, here's a serious option, here's a funny option, here's this option, but they really get to choose tone. So it's a bit like more like academic argument where you're talking about long form nonfiction and you want them to use the first person. It's a little more like that to me. So.
Thank you very much. That was illuminating. One other thing I might add to this conversation of assessment too is the idea of if production value is somewhat important. I mean, I think we heard that that's not going to be the main thing you're grading them on at all because most of them aren't coming in with this experience. You know, but if you do have big differences between more, say, sophisticated versions of film versus other, you can ask students to do reflections that they turn in as well. So in some cases, we heard that there's the written paper and there's also the AV version. So you can kind of put those together. But if you don't have that, students, you can ask students to talk about what were their intentions, what were their aims for this work, and then how well did they feel they met them? And if they had more expertise, what would they change or what would they do differently? And then that can give you a sense when you're assessing them too of what they were aiming for, even if the actual production fell somewhat short. So just to put that out there. Let's open it up to your questions. And I don't know how the sound is. I might like walk around and give you the mic.
I have actually a bunch of questions. My first one, I'd like to know from each of you what sort of structure you do give for the teaching of any technology. Do you give up class time for it? Do you have someone come to that class and teach your students? Do you require your students to go to workshops outside of class? Could you each take that question? Just tell me what you do.
I can take it and then leave. So for me, the science communication part of my assignment is more important than the podcast. So I make class time to have people that come give lecture. No, from ISS, from Relate, and then I also give my own lectures because I have an LSA sponsored podcast. I'm the host, so I do a lot of science communication, and then in terms of the technical part, I refer them to Sean, and then Anthony made a guide of how to upload everything on the podcast. So I make class time to go over the science communication and for them to work in pairs and where they can get feedback from me too, but on the very technical aspects of it.
It's outside.
Yeah, it's outside, yeah.
So very similarly, I will give them the assignment, and then we will actually spend time in the lab. So we'll bring them into this space often, and they'll be in that room actually launching. I'll say on the syllabus website launch, and by that point in the semester, they should have some research that they can post. They should have a poem. They should have some imagery. And I tell them beforehand that I can't help them with this, that they need to, if they want to have video, if they want to have sound, if they want to have certain things on their website, that by that point they should have it because they'll be in a room with someone who knows how to do that stuff.
Who comes to your class and teaches that? In the room.
In this space.
Yeah,
So when I bring them here, I tell them, find out at that time, ask all the questions you need to ask then. The other thing is that because I really front load the class work-wise for 2 reasons. One, I want to weed out folks because they're going to be working in groups. And if they're not going to be around, I don't want them to take up space. And then two, because the more of a knowledge base that they have early on, the better things go later on in the semester. And so by the time we get to the point of some kind of production, whether it's doing the podcasting or making a film, I'm fairly nimble with the syllabus, and so I can say, okay, it looks like, you know, a good point Sean was making about group work is that it is fun often, but there's usually in every class a small minority of students who do find it difficult because either their schedules, you know, I know we have often very fortunate students, but we also sometimes have students who work full time and do other things, have families that they're helping out with or doing things with, and so what happens is that there's often a time when I have to say, okay, this class time I'm gonna release you. And you have to make use of this time. If you have no other time for your group to get together, you'll have this hour and a half or 3 hours to do this. So that's pretty much how it's organized.
So I think I'll use my time to plug some of the services that are here. We do have resources for classes in terms of workshops that we can create here that can be either during class time, out of class time. We also have a group of students that usually sit in front of that television who can answer some very basic questions. And we also have students that are in the far back right-hand corner there that have office hours that can teach people from scratch how to use iMovie, GarageBand, Photoshop, you know, whatever. And those are by appointment, but we also have open office hours as well. As well as, you know, if there is a problem, they can email us, that kind of thing. I think from my experience, because we've done a bit of these now, is that if you're able to dedicate some class time to this stuff, it really does help. Because like Van was saying, you know, if there are students that don't have the freedom of movement or time, that it really does give them the opportunity, right? And especially if you work with us as far as getting some additional help during that class time, we can help students revise their content, right? So we can, you know, if they have technical problems, if they're trying to solve something in the editing program, we can assist them with that, or if they have questions that come up. So it gives them kind of an opportunity to kind of compile all their questions into one time frame. I know for the SAC 236, we've done extensive work in that department. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also going to plug ISS. We wholeheartedly in every way rely on them for almost every technical aspect of the course. Matthew Solomon spends 0 time in lecture talking about film production. The only thing we do in class is we dedicate at least 3 sections for them to come into this space and use the lab, and the whole entire time is theirs to use. Oftentimes, though, I mean, we encourage students to live with Blue Core, to hang out with them, be best friends with them. But generally, the students use the online resources that ISS has, their tutorials on iMovie and other editing softwares. You know, hypothetically, all the students need to complete these assignments is to know how to import a file, to make a cut, and to pause something. And they learn that really easily, and then they usually get bored with it, and then you know, use those resources to figure out how they could expand it. So I've never had a student say it took me much time outside of class to do this. I mean, of course, the assignments take a lot of time, but they've never had a problem coming to Blue Core, anything online, even YouTube. They use YouTube a lot. So
yeah, we can get somebody from knowing nothing about video editing to using GarageBand or iMovie in under half an hour. And so there's really no barrier to entry here other than access to the space and access to the resources.
Yeah, I gave them Sean organized some kind of orientation for them, which was actually, I had to be out of town for a talk anyway, so it was perfect. And then I gave them one class session in the lab here, which actually ended up being quite a bit like regular teaching in that I gave them some of the historical background or whatever, and I'd walk around and they'd be like, oh, professor, is this right? Or does it seem plausible to you that this is what's happening in this clip, right? And so I think it really works in that way. I just wanted to say something you said about the technical thing. I put all the film majors together, and it actually worked for the anxiety because they just knew. And I was like, this is the film majors group. So I think in some ways making that happen. Otherwise, they were like, oh, it'll be so unfair if I don't have a film major in my group. And I was like, well, you won't. So anyway.
How feasible is to do something like that in a study abroad group, given the time crunch is 6 weeks and being not here?
Try to keep it, I would say try to keep it as simple as possible, right? So almost everybody has a camera now, right? And so if they're able, depending on what you want them to do, right? And depending on what you want them to create, if you want them to create like a travelogue, or if they want them to create reflection pieces, like webcam recording, that kind of thing really works for reflection pieces, right? It really depends on what you want to do with them, but I think it can work. And if they're if they're collaborating over distance, the tools are there now, and we can kind of help you with that. That it makes it feasible to do that. In terms of especially using Box, and if, depending on what we're doing, using Google Drive, that kind of collaboration can really work at a distance.
Yeah, I just want to say that it sort of depends on the scope of the assignment, of course, but to me, it's more a matter of access to the technology that you need. So with SAC 236, the reason why it works is because it's only editing. I think if we had them all shooting things, it would be nearly impossible. They have their own personal computers. There's tons of labs here, and we give them the HD file through Box. So they have it. They can sort of do it on their own time. If you had to manage, we only have 3 cameras, but now we need to spread it out. Who's going to use them then? To me, that would be much more difficult. It's still possible, but it's more about access.
And I'll just say too that both iMovie and GarageBand, and there are free, and there are free versions on PC too. That not iMovie and GarageBand specifically, but there are equivalent editing software for there.
I would add to that too that Sweetland has an online writing lab that our peer writing consultants use. So study abroad students can use that, and there is a way to share the things that they're looking at, so they could get help on that work as well.
I was going to say, I'm sorry, I have to go. But the other thing that was a surprise to me was the Box, the fact that each student has a Box account, and so they can make sound files and create their own podcasts through that, and they don't necessarily have to be in this space, or they can do that from their room. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm curious if you've had to make any change in the structure of your course with these projects, and maybe inserted assignments to touch upon subject areas that the incorporation of media allows more depth or an expression different than what you had in the structure of your course prior to when you started incorporating media into it.
Yeah, I just want to say that, thankfully in our course, it's the focus the entire time. So the techniques that they're learning from narrative media, honestly, they're just learning to apply it to their own assignment. So in terms of film analysis, no. We have had to sort of change the structure of the assignments in the sense that we want to remind them at any time that this is a form of communication, that like writing should be revised constantly and peer-reviewed and things like that. So we've had to really jam-pack how the assignments are put together, not in terms of adding more assignments, but adding more sort of concrete layers to them, meaning you write the script, you turn that in, you get peer review, you turn in the rough draft of the video, get peer review, change it, which has been very difficult. And this semester I feel like it's sort of inhibited growth of the course in the sense of I think peer review is good and it's necessary, but it can spread along all these assignments. It has really like sucked up everybody's time, and so it's trying to find a balance between that. So I just use as an example of doing a good thing that, if it's not structured correctly, could actually be a sort of a negative thing. But yeah, that's in assignments is where we've had to do that.
I think for me, the final paper wasn't going well. So they do short writing in the first 3 weeks, then they do 2 kind of pretty conventional papers. And unless they have some previous humanities experience, they're pretty anxious. And they've been talking to me and they've been trying to fix it. And so by the time they get to this, it becomes a really nice spot for them to spend almost a month kind of working with each other. So I guess I don't structure in the peer review, they just do it on their own.
So I'll just mention Monica's class here, because I think, traditionally science courses don't deal with science communication and popular science communication. And so by creating these podcasts in her course and really putting the effort to transform them into pop sci podcasts, this is a whole new door that they've opened for this, right? And so that can translate to any field, right? Any way you can kind of get your students to think about the jargon and then translate it into, a more accessible form and communicate it in a podcast or in a video, that's going to get them to think about it on a higher order. And so it does allow you to add more to your course to do this. Yeah.
Film festival crisis. What just happened? Yes. Okay. So how do you, when you put things online, do you worry about copyright? When you have students put their projects online, does the university have a stance on that?
So no, there is a stance, but no, we do not worry about it. One reason is the length of the assignments. So if they were 10 minutes, I might start worrying. Because you're with fair use, we clearly are in fair use in terms of educational use with the length of the clips that the students are using. We've spoken with the general counsel's office here, and they've said you shouldn't worry. Music is actually our much more concern. We haven't really dealt with that. The students I think this semester is the first time where we've had them required to use music. And from what the general counsel's office had said, that changes things quite a bit. Because unless you're editing the music or something like that. But with the video clips, no. And we're dealing with these big bad studios, which if you put it on YouTube, oftentimes they'll just shut you down. And I've spoken with, for example, Warner. At one time I put a clip from a film online to use in an essay. It was an essay for the final exam. They shut it down in literally 20 minutes. With these, I've never had one shut down. I've spoken with them and they said, yeah, we have literally nothing to say. They're not long enough. The clips aren't long enough. There's voiceover, there's text, so absolutely no problems.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the key is transforming the work, right? And so, I am not a lawyer, and I'm definitely not a university lawyer. Yeah. But I being in this space, I kind of have to be educated on these things, and I'll say that 99% of the use that's going to happen out of this discussion and in other projects is going to be fair use, right? But that comes with a huge asterisk that people may not be aware of, is that fair use is not a right, it's a defense, it's a legal defense, right? And so you can still get things taken down even though you've only used a short portion based on DMCA or something like that, but that your defense would be fair use. I think, in terms of what we're accomplishing here, I think, if you're doing a podcast and they add music to the front, make sure that's like a royalty-free music or something that they have actually paid for, right? As opposed to using a popular song, right? Ditto on especially anything that goes up publicly. You have to be really careful about that. There are, you can look at it, YouTube has a couple of publishers that are okay to use, right? I think, I don't remember which music publishers they are, but there are some that are freely accessible music that is pretty popular music that you can incorporate. One of the issues if you're doing film analysis is a lot of film that music is important, right? And so that's where it becomes challenging, and length is really important, keeping it short, keeping it 10, 15 seconds long at most for your example.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that I mean, there are a lot of Creative Commons and open access of sound files and also image files, and that's something that Sweetland can help students to access and look for if they need help with that, as well as
Yeah,
ISS.
we actually have an online database of sound files that they can use that are free to use. I think you can find it on our website. Essentially, when you find our video tutorial series, there is a box folder that has both our sound files that are freely available, but also ones from the School of Music, and there are literally thousands.
Thanks so much for organizing this. There's so many possibilities. I teach music courses, and I focus on popular music. And so I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little more. I know that sometimes the fear of, I know that like the restrictions on incorporating popular music are really strict. And I mean, when you were talking about all these, I had so many ideas about what to do in class. Like I would love to, for instance, like trace the connections between funk and hip hop using samples or something like that, and getting the students to understand how these things can be recontextualized. And the media that you're showing seems like the perfect way to get students to actively understand these practices as something that's really multidimensional and very creative and complex. But how do you get around that? I mean, can you have them show it in class? I mean, is there like can you simply, are you wading into the deep end of the pool if you simply sample, or like for an educational video, include, say, I don't know, a break from Parliament Funkadelic or something like that? I mean,
Yeah. So the big thing there is where you're putting it, right? So if it's something that you're only having the students create for the course, or is going to be presented in a film festival kind of arrangement, there's a lot more leniency as far as that goes. If it's going to be something on YouTube, the good example of this being done well, the site Vox does a series on music analysis. And the way that they end up doing it, they do use clips from all sorts of things. They do proper attribution. They keep it short, and they usually add some kind of visual element that walks the person through what's important from the music. So the music isn't used as like aesthetics, right? It's used as a way of kind of moving the argument forward, right? Yeah.
So you could do that then. So you could like just highlight. That's what I was thinking. Like
Yeah.
highlight a specific phrase, and then just use visuals to say like, look what we're doing here. Look
Yeah.
what George Clinton's doing with this.
Yeah,
film here.
like a good example of something I've seen before is people taking hip hop music and like actually writing out the words, so then having like counting syllables with like colored blocks, right? And doing something like that that's relatively easy to do in an editing program, but it does comment upon the music, right? And that's really the key.
Right. Yeah, I want to complicate that for 1 second though.
Yeah.
I think that what the key thing that Sean is saying is that you're talking about the music, you're analyzing the music. When students are analyzing the visuals, which is more common in my class, and they just throw music on there, that suddenly then the music is not being used necessarily for the educational purposes.
Right.
You do also, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I hate that we have to keep saying that, but there is also the concern of sync rights when you take music, even and then you put visuals over it. So I actually would be afraid to do that in some cases. So the university is dealing with that right now, and it has to do with sports. But when they just play music just like in an arena, that's fine. But when they actually make a video and they put that same music on a video, then they can potentially violate sync rights, which is like giant. And they're like, yeah, that's what it's called when you take music and you match it to like images. And so that's a completely different license that the university has to usually like specifically pay for. So unless the visuals are specifically adding to the analysis, I would be afraid to do that. I'm not saying don't do it, but you want to make sure that everything you're doing is building upon your analysis, is part of the educational experience or the scholarship.
Yep. Right. I would also add that it would really be beneficial if you talk to the copyright office here, because what'll happen is it may be that they would want to create a subset of songs for your students to work with, right? That they can get access to, that they can get rights to, and so instead of giving them a wide range of, say, pick a reggae song, they may give you like a couple of different albums or artists to work with, right? And so do that before you design your assignment, because that might change the way your assignment is designed. Yeah.
I want to just augment a point that was made about the rhetorical dimension of using these different media, so that students will want to say, oh, this is so cool looking. I'm just going to bring in this image because I really like the way it looks, or this sound because I really love this song and it makes me feel a certain way, or whatever, so I want it here. But part of the learning dimension, I think, of doing this digital work is helping them also to see that you don't want any fluff, right? Everything is there for a reason. And so that if you're, and that's true in writing, right? But that also with making a digital assignment, if you're using a certain sound, it's because it's really contributing to the analysis or the argument, or an image or whatever. And so I think that can also be a way to get them thinking more broadly about evidence and analysis and supporting their work. I think I saw another hand.
We've created a web page for each of our panelists and for our moderator, Naomi, that has their assignments. It has links to the blogs, videos, some of their insights. That will be published next week. If you left your email with us, I'll send it to you. Otherwise, come to our website and look for that. I want to thank our panelists and those that had to leave early, and I thank you for coming out today. Have a good afternoon.